annual Respect Life presentation for this year's Respect Life Month. And you know, the last 2 years we've had different speakers to come, and we're happy this is our third year that we can offer this this talk. Not this talk, but a pro-life talk. And we're honored to have Dr. Joseph Thornton with us this year. From '96 to 2003, Dr. Joe was on the faculty of the University of Texas Health Science Center at San Antonio. He was the medical director of the inpatient psychiatry unit there and founded the Safe Family Project, which is a prevention of family violence. Before coming to Gainesville, Dr. Joe was on the faculty of the University of Pittsburgh and the University of South Florida. Dr. Joe first joined University of Florida's College of Medicine faculty in 2010, where he serves as a professor of psychiatry. Currently, Dr. Joe is the chief of Psychiatric Services for UF Health Services Hospital, UF Shands Hospital, and has over 24 publications and several teaching awards. Are you still working with the VA too, Dr. Joe?
No, I'm retired.
Okay, there you go. And so please join us in welcoming Dr. Joseph Thornton to St. Helens Respect Life Apostolate.
Thank you very much. So we'll have to reboot, so I'll talk through the first section of the slides. I can do that. Also, I'm torn. I'm not used to sitting down, but if I stand up, I'll be like 8 feet above you. So I'll try to sit down without wiggling too much. If we may, let's start off with our Father. Our Father,
who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Try again. As disclosure, so you heard I'm currently with the University of Florida, and typically when we give talks, we talk about disclosure, so who funds us, and sort of a new trend, I think we'll see more and more, is that it's relevant on not who just gives us money, because you wonder what your biases may be, but it may be significant to know who we give money to. So for example, in some academic circles we find that, not surprisingly, there's heavy contributions to choice organizations, and they publish a lot about mental health and abortion. So it's relevant, I think, to say where your money goes. So I'm paid by University of Florida. Nobody else is paying me yet. I'm waiting. And then I give money to the church, to AMA, American Medical Association, American Psychiatric Association. I'm affiliated with on the board of directors for Floridians Against the Death Penalty, and I'm with the Catholic Medical Association, St. Gianna Guildford, Assistant State Director for Florida. And I think, I'm also the unit director for the UNESCO Bioethics Unit chair that's based in, and we have a unit here in Gainesville, or UF, and it's one of 200 units worldwide, and so I work in that group. So let's see if we can turn this on. I thank Philomena for inviting me to talk about the death penalty to Respect Life organization. You may be aware there's sometimes a disconnect between the two entities. And I'll put into some perspective, from a public health perspective, why do we die in America, what are the causes of death, and how does this relate to Respect Life issues. So in the U.S. and most places, our mortality rate is about 1% per year. So about 3 million people die each year. So that's a lot. A little over 800,000 die from heart disease, about 600,000 from cancer, and then on down the line. As a psychiatrist, I'm interested in the 40,000 who die by suicide each. Well, it's been increasing the past few years. And then from other lines of work, homicides, about 20,000. Most people aren't aware of that your chance of dying by suicide is at least 1.5 to 2 times the risk of being a victim of homicide. And so suicide's like the 10th leading cause of death. You may have heard about opiate deaths. They run now about 60 to 70,000 per year. They've been increasing about 20,000 per year the past 2 years, almost directly related to fentanyl. When we look at other forms of death, abortions don't normally get counted in CDC data, but it's about 800,000 each year. Y'all would know better than these exact numbers. What I read in this said it's been decreasing about 5% per year the past 5 years, which is good news. There's a concept of extrajudicial homicide. It'd be like, it's where there's a homicide, it's just the death of one human by another human. Extrajudicial means it's legal, but it was outside the court system. So like with police or self-defense, something like that, estimates are about 1,200 people die the past couple of years each year by that means. And then for executions in 2015, it was 28. So it sounds like it is a small number, and so why is that important? Why do we talk about the death penalty when we have all these other things going on? And the reason why we talk about the death penalty in respect to life is twofold. Sometimes I feel like I get these interlocutions, and this morning was one where if we support the death penalty, we support the concept that secular power can determine the worthiness of human life. And from a respect to life perspective, that's not what we believe. We believe that human life is sacred. We don't put conditions on it. We don't certainly wouldn't delegate that authority to the state senators, but we do. That's the fact with the death penalty is that the state assumes that authority and power to judge the worthiness of human life. The other aspects of the death penalty that are important for us is that in USA, the medical field is required to participate in the death penalty for reasons I'll explain, that not maybe direct, we don't do the direct injection, but healthcare people write the protocols that the courts approve, and healthcare people are involved in various aspects of the process. And so without the participation of healthcare, you could not have the death penalty, and it sets the stage for healthcare to participate in killing. So with these small numbers, we then become the stage point for physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. It's sort of a variant in Pope Paul VI, Humanae Vitae. He cautioned that if people had the right to determine their reproduction, if they could choose contraception, abortion, the states could assume those same rights and impose it on people, which we've seen happen in China. Similarly, when the state has the right to determine the worthiness of human life, we've seen in Canada, the courts rule that a person can determine when life is worth living or not, and then they can even require other people to make that decision and carry out euthanasia. So it's an important issue, even though the numbers may be small, it can transform in a horrific way. So am I going to be doing this without slides?
No, I was looking for my laptop. I have my laptop.
So I'll cover, I've got some pictures, so I'll cover the things I can do verbally. So when I talk about the death penalty, I'm going to stand up and I'll point back this way. When we talk about the death penalty, I say that the death penalty is unnecessary, it's unjust, it's untrue, it's unconscionable. And I'll go through each one of those. When we say it's unnecessary, the justification for using the death penalty most often is that it's self-defense, that a society has right to defend itself. And there's no question about that. Individuals in society has the right to defend itself. But we also know that that right to defend oneself has to be in proportion to the threat. So if you have alternative means other than taking human life to defend yourself, the expectation is that you do that. And as a society, we can do that quite well. We have a tremendous amount of experience with prisons. The United States is the best experienced place for running prisons, and we keep people secure, and we can keep them safe inside the prison system. So we don't need to execute people to keep society safe, nor to keep the inmates and staff safe. You can manage it without the death penalty. So it's really unnecessary. When we say it's unjust in the sense that it's unfair. It is not applied equitably, and you can look at that by geography, by race, by economics, and just by the DA who is running the case. So when we look at geography, we know that I think it's 38 states have the death penalty, so that means what, 13 don't have the death penalty. And when we look at murder rates and other issues in the South, which leads the country in executions and the death penalty, we actually have higher homicide rates than in the Northeast, which has about 1% of the executions and much lower homicide rates than the rest of the country. So in many states, you can't even be facing a capital crime just because of where you were arrested and where the crime occurred. So when we look at the USA, there's not justice in the terms that there's a different application based on where you live. Also, when we look at race, there's disproportionate representation in prosecution of African Americans and also by victims. So I think it's roughly, if the victim is white, there's 80% higher chance that there'll be a capital crime pursued rather than if the victim is African American. Florida holds the distinction, I guess it's maybe in the country, that this year was the first time a white man had been executed for the murder of a black man. Otherwise, it always been white on white or black on white. So it's unfair by race. It's also unfair by conduct. So we know there are something we call outlier prosecutors. So we had one in Jacksonville. She was defeated in the last election, but some prosecutors make their career based on being tough on crime, and they can tout out pursuing capital crimes as their calling card. So they don't look at other avenues how to be tough on crime or provide justice, but they just use the death penalty. And we will find in most cases when they come up for review, is that you'll find that there's like on the poster we have like 5 instances where prosecutors withheld what's called exculpatory evidence, where they had evidence, they knew that the person they were convicting didn't commit the crime, but they pursued it anyway and got the conviction, put them on death row. But they get their scorecard that they got the capital conviction. So we know there's misconduct for that. So it's unfair by geography, by race, and by misconduct.
How common is that?
Pardon?
How common is that?
It's not common. So like I said, 5 known prosecutors in the past, say 30 years. But how many innocent people need to be executed for us to be concerned? This is sort of where we lie. And then it becomes unconscionable because if we know that it's unnecessary, unfair, and unjust, why do we continue to do it? Why do we support it? And so we need to speak out against it. And this may come just in time where I can show some pictures.
All right, I think I got juice, don't worry about it. But it has his name.
That's right. So we'll come back to our fathers shortly. So these were the figures I talked about. So this is also the highlight. So this is really the most important sentence of the whole presentation. If you support the death penalty, it means using secular power to judge the worthiness of human life. That's what we have to consider that's at stake. And then the other part is that unlike other types of deaths, like even with abortion, even though we're opposed to it being legal, we're opposed to it being promoted, it ultimately comes down to the decisions of individuals, of the mother and the healthcare providers. So it's ultimately they're responsible for that decision.
Can I ask a question on that first point? Allowing secular powers to determine the worthiness of life. Doesn't the church also say, though, that the state has the right to use capital punishment in times when it's needed?
Yes.
So, okay.
Yes.
So even though, so you still have that, if the state has that right to do it, you still have that possibility that they'll usurp that power and do evil with it, kind of thing.
Right, and we've seen the consequences of that. So we've seen, through the several hundred years of where the state does assume the power to determine that certain people aren't worthy of life, and they proceed to kill them. It continues to this day, where states determine that. The intent, when I read the quotes just this morning from St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, was that the state, it was a divinely authorized state power. The notion was is that the secular authorities were divinely enthroned, so to speak, and so they were acting on behalf of God. So if we believe that our state senators are acting on behalf of God, I guess you can take comfort in that. Also, because you have permission to do something doesn't mean you're required to do something. And that, to me, is our ultimate responsibility. Even, I've been careful not to challenge the permissibility of capital punishment. I do challenge necessity and fairness for it. Because when people think about the death penalty, they think it's for the most heinous crime, they think it's for the most heinous people, they think it's necessary to defend us, and almost never are those things true, particularly in the United States.
I hear a lot of people saying, I don't want to pay $60,000 to keep somebody, or $100,000. It's actually money to keep that person alive, and that's one of the things I get to hear when I work in hospice and palliative care, that, you know, why should I support this person while they committed such a heinous crime? And I'm just playing devil's advocate. I don't believe in
that argument, of course, it doesn't work, but if you look at the bottom middle, the 51 million versus 1 million, that financial argument is actually the main thing that's helping us in Republican states to get rid of the death penalty. So Nebraska, New Hampshire, for example, got rid of the death penalty with Republican-controlled houses based on the financial argument that it costs more to maintain capital punishment system and keep people on death row than it does to house them in the prison system. And I can give you concrete reasons for that in a minute. Go ahead. Okay.
You mentioned St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine. In their time, there were not prisons. We have a very highly developed carceral system where people are in and that the public is perfectly protected, and that was not true in the time of St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas.
Correct. So the financial argument's fairly easy to address. The other argument to address when we're talking about justice, when we're talking about bringing people responsible to account for their crimes, so we spend all this time, money in I'll use the word evil, to maintain capital punishment, and yet we got 14,000 unsolved homicides in the state of Florida for the past 30 years. You know, could you take some of that $51 million to pursue the cold cases and get some closure for the people who've been murdered, for their families, and get some justice in terms of incarceration of those people? So the final argument that I think comes down to a moral choice is the notion of retribution. So they say, okay, we don't care if we can't kill off all the people, we don't care if we make a few mistakes, but you know, there has to be some retribution for the crime that was committed. And I don't know how they answer that. You know, they say there's a difference between retribution and vengeance. I can't really tell what that difference is, and I can't address that one. So in terms of retribution or vengeance, yeah, the death penalty may accomplish some of that, whether you get the true person or not. But that means we all are participants. So as I was alluding to a little bit before, abortion is the people involved in the act. The death penalty involves us as a society because the state is acting in our name with our authority. And so we are direct participants in the executions and maintenance of the death penalty. And then for the healthcare system, healthcare sustains the death penalty in the United States. Without it, without the healthcare participation saying that it's humane, and as a psychiatrist, I'm essentially a gatekeeper for who can be executed. If we didn't have those things in place, the courts wouldn't allow the executions to continue. This is doing some background. So started my history in '93. Actually, my I say my rebirth was in '92, when the National Health Service Corps sent me to Union Correctional Institution. So I'm a convert. I'm a prison convert to Catholicism. I've been too smart for school, so to speak. So I grew up disciples of Christ and got into college, and just a smart, good guy. Why didn't I have to go to church? And then as I started my assignment at the prison, it was so overwhelming, the changes in culture, the changes in the environment and the expectations, that I was confronted with forces of good and evil, not good people, bad people, although there were certainly examples of both, but forces of good and evil where you could have good people do some really bad things in prison, when you're talking about your officers or even physicians who, out of various things that happened there, would take a man out of their cell and just pound them, or just do things to people that you obviously would consider a crime and horrific in any other setting. This next slide shows, so this is UCI. It's about 88 acres up in Rayford, 50 miles north of here, surrounded by swamp. 1,800 men lived at that facility. With that 1,200th expectation they would die inside the facility, most of them serving life sentences. In this northeast, on the upper right, where you see the configuration of buildings, that's a 2-story building, that's Florida's death row. So when I was there, 305 men were living on death row, and now it's gone up to like 348, something like that. So the next slide just shows a little closer picture. So they're all single cells. They have two, it's like a classic prison. So you have a little walkway that goes by the cells, and they have bars on the cells. And then you have another walkway protected by cells so the officers can do checks on the cells they're open. But the medical officer had to be on the inside to go make weekly rounds on the guys on death row to make sure they had access to health care. So you may not know that inmates are the only people in the United States who have the constitutional right to health care. And that's partly how it got assigned there, was the federal courts had taken over the health care in Florida prisons and set rules and monitors that care was provided. But there I was providing health care. I knew, as a psychiatrist, the first year I'd know some about their cases and mental health issues, but the 2.5 years as a chief health officer, I went by for their health care. So saw each one of them every week. Later, from 2003, 2010, I was here in Gainesville, North Florida Evaluation Treatment Center. It has 200 men there who are sent for either competency restoration so they can go to trial, or they were found not guilty by reason of insanity. And then the last couple of years I was there, Florida law had changed so that for people on death row, they had to be competent to proceed with appeal. So if they were mentally ill or had some disturbance and they couldn't work with their attorneys on the appeal of their case, they had protections other inmates didn't have, that they had to be deemed competent. So there was an effort, and they sent 2 guys to us. So you go from Rayford, 50 miles away, 3 triple fences and armed guards, down to NFETC, where we had nice people with 1 honor fence looking at the restoration. So I had a conflict of interest in providing that evaluation, but that's where I say the death penalty was psychiatrists or gatekeepers. So someone says, oh, I see little green men and I don't know who my attorneys are and all this stuff. And so they technically, just on the surface, don't meet competency to stand to go for their appeal. And so the proceedings have to stop and they can't be executed. And it's my job to read their mind to see if they're telling the truth or not as a psychiatrist. And that's a little too close. We also know there's another step closer, which is actually what got me directly involved in this, was 2013. John Ferguson, this is all public knowledge, I can talk about it, was saying that he knew he was going to be executed, but I think he was Jesus Christ and he was going to be resurrected. And so he was okay from himself to go to execution. His attorneys read the notion that maybe he's insane and shouldn't be executed. 3 psychiatrists went to see him as a group. There's 3 people in the room with him. They interviewed him. 1 person wrote a report. They all 3 signed it, said he was good to go, and he was executed. And I go, wow, that's so. The psychiatrists there didn't really, even by their own standards, provide the normal level of care that you would do, and they make the ultimate decision if he could be executed or not. And there are few things that are really that black and white in psychiatry.
Dr. Joe, but if he is mentally insane, how can you rehabilitate someone? What would be the purpose? I mean,
Right, right. So if they're insane, you rehabilitate them, you medicate them, and the courts allow you to medicate them so that they can then be executed. Which is, how about that? Now, as a psychiatrist, your ethics don't allow you to force medications on one solely for the purpose of being executed, but if you believe their psychosis represents a threat to their physical health or other people's. In prison, homicide's not a reason for psychiatric intervention, because at UCI, everyone was homicidal, and so you just managed it. In fact, I came to the conclusion, I've given talks, that homicide's a normal behavior. It's not a sign of mental illness. But there's some things, mental illness interferes with your ability to take care of yourself and function, so we do force medications for that. But the forced medication so someone can be sane enough to be executed, that's against psychiatric ethics. But it's permissible by law.
Is there a board above you that, are you just the top where oversees you, or is there, and there's no oversight is what you're saying?
The judge does. So one of these cases, I was with Judge Levin Perry, I think he's now in the Supreme Court, and I'm giving him my psychiatric explanation. Oh, about 45% one way, 65% another. And he goes, Doc, this is a court, it's black and white, he either is or he isn't. You know, that's the way the courts operate. There's no gray room, and yet in reality, there is gray room. And so I've made personal decisions a long time ago, if it's gray room, make the error on the side of life. One of my rules of operations, make sure everyone can survive their mistakes. And that operates generally as a position. So this is just examples of what the so-called death chambers for lethal injection look like. They're somewhat similar to a gurney, or if you've ever been in the OR, it looks like this. So at this stage, I'm just trying to show that it's a medical procedure. The executions, certainly lethal injections, are a medical procedure. And the protocols written out, I'm sorry, looks like I have some. Okay. Yeah, no, it's small print, but it describes the procedure. So a week before the execution, the patient's examined to have accessible veins. If you're going to do lethal injection, you have to start a vein. Have you ever heard someone had trouble getting an IV started? Right, so they have to check on that. And a lot of these guys had substance abuse histories, and they have difficult veins to reach, or they may have hepatic disease or a variety of things. Then when we get to the day of execution, you offer them some Valium, said you might be a little nervous today, because they know 2 weeks ahead of time when their date is. And so you offer them some Valium, so they have to have a physician's order for the Valium to give them injections so they don't create such a big scene when they go be let off for execution. And then they get to the gurney, they're restrained down on the gurney like you would be for an OR, for surgery, and they're given a sedative like here. It used to be Versed, midazolam, so that the person would go to sleep and not pay attention to the rest of the procedure. The state can no longer acquire midazolam, and so they're coming up, they have a protocol for a different drug that wears off in about 6 minutes or so. But they'll be asleep, and then they're given a paralytic so that they can't move, and then they could die from suffocation after about 10, 12 minutes, but they added on with potassium chloride to cause a cardiac arrhythmia. So the whole process takes about 20 minutes, and the idea for the humane part is they sleep through it. So it's a medical procedure, and then the doctor declares that they're dead. So to convince you it's a medical procedure? And oddly enough, as Canada is going to physician-assisted suicide, they run into some unreliability with the pills and prescriptions, so they're using some process similar to this to help assisted suicide. We start an IV in paralytic and then something to stop the heart. So I don't think we should be doing that. And then other forms of medical participation is looking at the relevant medical evidence for trial, mitigating aggravated circumstances, so that's where the psychiatrist comes in. We make a judgment, and there's one psychologist that testified in 300 capital cases, and he had a common finding that this person's obviously dangerous, and he'll kill again if he has a chance, and that's used as an aggravated circumstance to go to trial. So it doesn't mean the whole medical profession is corrupted, but if you get one or two individuals, they can create havoc with the credibility of the system. Okay, so in the reason medical's involved, I'd say if you ever want to do something evil, just get a doctor's note, because you know this from all types of things. So if you want marijuana, get a doctor's note, call it medical marijuana. If you want opiates, get a doctor's note, because used to you had to use heroin, and then in the 2000s would give you the opiate prescriptions. And if you want to kill someone, just say, well, it's a doctor's orders. And doctors are supposed to be the ones who can do it safely and humanely. And so that's why they use the medical profession. And so even though it may be a few individuals in healthcare, it contaminates, I make the argument, contaminates the whole healthcare relationship, particularly when we move out of executions into physician-assisted suicide. So it's the physician offering you the option of physician-assisted suicide because that's what you're asking for, or because it would just be more convenient and less expensive if we didn't waste so much money on your end-of-life care. So it adds more urgency to these type of issues. So I've covered this type of stuff. So they say the death penalty brings closure. Folks, you'll hear that. That's the most common thing when executions occur. Oh, the family gets to have closure now about what happened to their family member 10, 20, 30 years ago. And that's very hard to measure. There's some relief that the process is over because there's general agreement that having someone on death row for a crime, it keeps the tension involved for all the participants. That keeps the issue open. Whereas if they go to prison for their punishment, that's the closures. They're in prison, that's where they're going to spend their life. But if they're waiting to be executed, it's like this thing, that means the punishment, they don't go to prison as punishment, they go to prison to be held there until they're executed. So it perpetuates the open wound of the homicide. This is a picture of our bishops, Bishop Estevez and some of the other clergy, and then Christine Henderson from Floridians Against the Death Penalty, having a press conference over the request that Father Roberts had. Father Roberts was the priest who ministered to disadvantaged folks, people in and out of prison. He was murdered by someone he was trying to help. But he had an advance directive written in 1995 saying that if I'm ever killed in this line of work, don't seek the death penalty. And so they pleaded that the prosecutors don't seek the death penalty. The prosecutor continued to do that, but then they reached a plea bargain with the defendant, and that brought about the closure. So we heard about St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine where the death penalty is permissible. They didn't say that it's required. The saint that, of course, these are influential. Saint Maria Goretti, I didn't really know. How many people have heard of her or know about her? Okay. So I'm part of this group called Marian Catechist Apostolate. I guess I should have had them on there. And I try to go to the shrine every couple of years up in Wisconsin. They have a shrine to Saint Maria Goretti. I didn't know who she was. This is 2013, and read about her. She's a young, I think 11 years old, was murdered by a neighbor who was making advances on her, stabbed, I think, 21 times, 27 times, something like that. And he was captured and put in prison, and was a violent, hostile, hateful person in prison for 6 years in solitary confinement. Then he has a vision of her coming into his cell, and I think the flowers were actually miraculously delivered in his cell, 21 flowers, and she forgave him for what he did. He had a conversion, changed his life, changed his demeanor, eventually got released from prison, immediately went to apologize or make amends to the mother of St. Maria, and the mother instantly forgave him, actually took him into her home, and then both, I think it's both the mother and he went to St. Maria Goretti's canonization. And then there's some talk about maybe he should be considered for sainthood for his conversion. So anyway, I met her in 2013, and I'm here one Saturday after a rosary in front of the Blessed Tabernacle, and that's where I get the interlocution to end the death penalty. And it was around the same time John Ferguson's event occurred. And so I've known him as a psychiatrist and as a chief health officer, and huge people involved. And the death rows in our area. The people who live and work there are in our area, North Florida, Rayford. And it was obvious if I didn't say something about the death penalty, who would? I mean, I was there, I'm a witness to it. And so I have that responsibility to declare about the lie that the death penalty is and that the harm it does to us. Because it's about us, it's not about the person who committed the crime, but it's about us as a society, as individuals. And then, of course, we know about St. Mother Teresa visited the people in death row in California and said that they were the faces of Christ. And then John Paul the Great had wrote in the Catechism that the death penalty is basically unnecessary. So it's unconscionable. We have to denounce it. Otherwise, we're participants in the death penalty. And the notion, because we're going to hear more for physician-assisted suicide, that people can declare when their life is worth living or not. Because that's also here, that these people who commit these crimes aren't worth living, that they're so substandard as human beings, they don't deserve to live. So if society says that, individuals can say that about themselves. We've got the courts say that unborn are not people. You know, you look at the ultimate dehumanization. You have to have a certain IQ to be a human being. You know, when you become demented and dependent on care in a nursing home or court-appointed guardians going to make the decision about your end-of-life care. So those are the things that we're confronting. And then ultimately comes down to mercy. You know, every day we pray, sometimes multiple times a day, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive others. That's the only command in the prayer, the Lord's Prayer. And, you know, where are we going to be? If I make a mistake, I'd rather make a mistake being merciful than making judgment. And then this sort of what we do now, George is here. We go out to vigils for the executions and sort of wave the flag and say this is wrong, but we need more of that. And it's very encouraging that the Respect Life movement has taken this on, and we pray together.
Actually, St. Patrick's Catholic Church and our deanery, that's going to be their secondary focus.
Because we're all, you know, it's all for the same goal. Okay. Any questions or comments?
So they prior to the medical procedures for death for row inmates, they were using the electric chair.
Right.
Was it switched to medical because it was perceived as being more humane, or was it because it, to the society in general, seemed to be more palatable, or it's related?
Both, yeah. So in one of my posters, I didn't show it, I looked at the various legal means of execution in the United States. So you still have firing squad in Utah, still electric chair in half a dozen states or more, gas chambers approved in several states. So those are the main means available. I think hanging might be allowed in one state. And then, of course, the guillotine was invented by a physician. It's not legal in the United States. But Robert Guillotine was a physician who invented the device to be a more humane way of executing people. The only one that doesn't really involve a doctor a lot is the firing squad. But they still, in the old laws, they use a doctor to, literally put a target on the inmate's chest for the people to shoot at. So they had a physician determine the best place to have the target, and the physician to determine they were dead. But yeah, the lethal injection is for the humaneness. So Nevada now uses fentanyl. They've gone to one drug, and they've executed a person about a month ago using fentanyl. It worked so well in the community, they found to start using it.
Was cost an issue too, or no?
Well, pharmaceutical companies took a moral stance not to provide the drugs for execution. Now, probably some economics involved in PR, but yeah, that's the problem with lethal injection now, is the states can't acquire the drugs.
Yeah, didn't it happen, like, was it a year ago, where person was on death row, they were giving them the drug and it didn't, person survived it? Does it ever occur?
That's occurred, yes.
So what happens, does that person still receive the death, or does he get let go if it doesn't
No,
happen the first
no.
time?
One of the cases I know about, he got executed like 20 days later.
Oh, really?
Their attorneys will make that.
Yeah.
But you're not sent there to be, at this one shot, you're sent there to be executed.
So it doesn't matter
Yeah,
how many times it takes?
Right, yeah. But-
So you mentioned the prosecutors, when the trial is over, they've kind of hidden
Oh,
some evidence.
Before the trial,
before the trial.
they get
So
evidence.
why as a society don't we ever hear about that? I mean, that would be excellent evidence to say, you know what, you're not giving all the evidence here, but yet you're having a checkbox next to your name that I prosecuted this person. Why haven't we heard about, I mean, that's wrong. That's
Right,
completely-
right.
It's an innocent person.
Yeah, you'd think that there'd be more uproar about it. You can find it on the FADP.org website and Death Penalty Information Center. They list the names and individuals and the years that this occurred.
You know, ethical wise, I mean, these prosecutors, they go to bed every night and sleep like a baby, knowing that an innocent person, they still practice.
Well, there's some notion that the ends justify the means. That's a common thing you'll hear. Well, it didn't matter that maybe he didn't do this particular crime, but he didn't deserve to live. He was a bad guy. So even with the exonerees, I showed a picture of 2 exonerees, even so they were found not guilty of the crime they were accused. I mean, not issues of mitigation. They simply didn't do it, and they were freed. And the prosecutors will say, well, he should be executed for something. So, yeah, it's amazing.
As I mentioned before, I asked about oversight. Is there anything down the road to, even though it might not be abolished, the death penalty, is there anything that they can even look at and say, okay, there's another avenue or somebody above or below the judge before it goes, or above you? I mean, no.
It's the governor.
Just, okay, the governor.
Because the governor is ultimately responsible. So that's where we send our prayers and our phone calls and our letters are to the governor. And our current governor set the record for the number of executions. Part of my conversion process, I learned about the stages of guilt. That's another lecture. But Governor Childs, the person I admired greatly, and then candidate Bush got into public arguments about crime, and they brought up this particular inmate that Childs hadn't executed him, and he was soft on crime. It was in the paper for a couple of weeks, and I'm treating this guy, and I asked, well, how are you dealing with all this? And he goes, oh, it doesn't bother me. I know those politicians are just as evil as we are. And, if you look at, I don't have the time to dig it all out, but the little bit of superficial I look at, there tends to be more executions in election years than not.
Dr. Thornton, have there ever been examples of medical professionals who've refused to cooperate?
Well, yeah, in a public sense, yes. It'd be hard to know in a private sense. For example, if you're a doctor at FSP and you refuse, they simply fire you. But they usually select people who The person who worked there when I was around was an enthusiastic supporter of the death penalty. The American Board of Anesthesiology will remove the board certification of an anesthesiologist who participates in execution or gives advice on an execution protocol.
So, can I reword that to make sure I understand? So, they'll remove the certification if they do participate.
The anesthesiologist will. They're the only board that I know that takes action like that. The state medical boards have routinely refused to do that because they say, well, it's state law, and so they're state-appointed people, so they don't take action. And,
Why do you think abortion is more accepted by the medical industry? Why don't they come out opposing abortion like they do the death penalty?
well, medical profession's not real great on opposing the death penalty. They just say they don't want to do it.
Okay, well, why don't they say that about
they have
abortion?
to.
What?
The abortion, they've bought into the notion that they're not human.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, that's hard to accept. Being
Yeah.
that they have a greater intellect in that regard, biology, than I would, and they still think that?
Well, like I said, I was too cool for school. I've been there. I was always somewhat pro-life. I think that's what attracted me to the Catholic Church. I grew up admiring Albert Schweitzer, who was Reverence for Life. So I grew up in an environment where it was unthinkable to do euthanasia and abortion. But the modern ethics is that there's different stages of life. So that's why it's so frightening now about assisted suicide and euthanasia. I think you're going to see it right up there with abortion in our lifetime for sure. Yeah.
Is there any opportunity for the Supreme Court to step in and make a federal law that would outlaw the use of the death penalty?
Right. That's been the main line of thought, that we expect the Supreme Court, or we did expect the Supreme Court would outlaw the death penalty. Even Justice Scalia, who voted to uphold it, had talking in other settings that he didn't think it was sustainable in the United States based on legal trends and what they call the evolving standards of decency. But,
They've come around to this saying this is the most humane way to kill somebody.
right.
But I was writing down the drugs as you said them,
Mhm.
and they're giving a paralytic before they give the potassium chloride.
Right.
A massive heart attack is extremely painful, and usually the people that have it are flailing, and so how humane is this?
No.
Well, you can't see the flailing, so it's
You can-
humane for the
exactly.
witnesses.
They're feeling it, it's just, they can't move, right?
Right.
Okay.
So the verse said, the problem sometimes is that it could wear off. They use a huge amount. That was their argument, that it wouldn't wear off. They use a huge dose. The etenamate that they propose to use has a much shorter half-life, and so, it's to be argued. I've taken the position I'm not going to argue about the protocols, because that would imply there's a correct protocol.
Right.
So I take a stance. I won't offer my 2 cents.
Good one note on these drugs and why the states had trouble getting these drugs. And you said it's partly business PR for the drug companies, but also several of these drugs were only manufactured in Europe, where the death penalty is out of law, forbidden, and the drug companies took a stand that they would not aid death penalty anywhere else either.
Right.
That's,
So, yeah, chalk one up for the drug companies for all the other things they've done. On this one, they made a difference. Yeah.
I found it a little strange that you said that, well, not strange, an observation. You said that the person is evaluated, and if they're considered crazy, they would not be sentenced to death penalty.
Well, it depends on what stage that evaluation comes in. So to be sentenced, you have to be competent. You have to know what you're being sentenced to. And to be executed, you have to be competent in the sense that you have to know why you're being executed.
So you have to be in the state of understanding that
Right.
you're being executed
Right.
because of the crime that you committed.
Right, so Alabama currently has an inmate who has severe dementia, can't even remember his whereabouts, much less the crime that he's convicted of.
So he would be someone that his lawyer should say he's not competent.
That's what the attorneys are arguing, that Alabama, attorneys do what they are geared up to do. They say that they're trying to argue it's not relevant.
With the new DNA technology, I was wondering how much are these crimes overturned? People on death row, they've gone back and looked at evidence on DNA and then released them. Is that like common, or is that very minuscule?
For our exonerees, it's usually the key evidence that gets them off. Now, there's something, we've got a brother in our area named Del Resinelli, who's an attorney and Catholic, used to do the prison ministries for 20 years here. He's written 2 or 3 books on the death penalty. And I can just feel his pain when he writes, when these cases come up. They call it procedural bar. So in constitutional law, if the appeals are mostly on the process, they don't retry the case for most of the processes. So the appeals is just to be sure, supposedly, that you got that the procedures are followed. So if you get new evidence that's exculpatory, like DNA evidence, they don't have to admit that, and they don't consider it when they go up to the Supreme Court appeals. And, if you want to talk about ultimate unfairness, so you have evidence that says that you may or may not be guilty, and the courts won't even allow it to be considered, or allow you to go get the evidence if it were available.
So in those cases, the reason they are let go is because.
They're not let go.
But you said that the process is what they're.
Yeah, so the process is that you have an attorney, were you given your rights, did you meet the deadlines for the filings, those type of things. It's paperwork and process.
In other words, if there was an irregularity in the
Right.
process, then
Yeah.
that could be cause, but
Yeah.
not evidence itself.
Right.
Well, that's what I mean, wouldn't DNA, the impermissibility of DNA, and or for whatever reason, wouldn't that be a procedural issue?
I'm not an attorney. Yeah, I learned a long time ago, logic doesn't apply to administrations and law.
Just play devil's advocate, don't you think that sometimes people on death row can have a conversion experience themselves, and just being on death row itself could be a way to God?
Well, that's what St. Thomas Aquinas argument. It says it sort of gets your attention and
Yeah,
focus.
yeah.
And if they're not focused at that point, well, they probably would never be focused.
Right.
That's his argument. Yeah, so in terms of the conversion, yeah, I'll leave it to the saints, but it still leaves it up to us and what we do.
When you talk about UCI, and those initials mean Union Correctional Institution.
That's correct.
And correctional is in the middle of it, that's the center of it.
That's correct.
And we've completely forgotten that.
Yes.
And that we forget that Christ died for the remission of our sins, and that we should consider that all men can be saved, transfer their lives. And the whole ethic of the death penalty just ignores
Right,
this.
so we'll close, I guess, with 2 more comments related to that. So one's the history of our prison systems is called penitential. You go there for penance and reform. We talk about reform schools, rehabilitation centers, correction institutions. Not, that's all gone. Whatever remnants were there have been stripped away. They're just, I don't know what, prison is the best term for them. I forgot. Other point.
They've been secularized, and
Oh, yeah, so, yeah, it's a secular notion, the idea of selling life.
So rehabilitation is just out of the question,
It's
all
out
they're
of the
doing
question.
is being contained.
It's a
So-
holding cell.
So that's really what we argue about from FADP, was we wanted a campaign, we called it Make Justice Work. People say we have a death penalty for justice. Well, if you wanted justice, then you'd have systems where kids could go to school, that they would have a safe home to sleep in, that they'd have food, that when they were incarcerated or acting out, that they'd have some structure and correction early on. So you intervene early for justice, not later. And the other point is to give sort of an example of that, how many, well, I'll just say, across the country, 10% of people in death row are veterans. In Florida, it's 18% of people in death row are veterans. When you look at the people executed the past 3 years, 20% are veterans. Now, is it possible, and there's evidence that it is, that some of their experiences and trauma that they went through contributed to their disruptive behaviors and things that they got captured for or convicted of. So there's case examples. There's some clear cases where you had people who maybe had criminal histories before the service, but other cases that are real clear, it started after the service.
But doesn't the state consider that they were trained in the military to do this and therefore it took it past?
They argue it makes them more dangerous. And
They
that
throw
they're a
the book at
disgrace to
them,
the
actually.
service.
Instead of trying to take care of the veterans
Right.
with their stress.
Now, the VA's acknowledged it in the past 2 years, and they're making greater emphasis. And they have a very good justice outreach program. And we believe, so I was with the VA 6 years. I was the chief mental health officer for 3 years from North Florida. And we're quite proud of the veteran justice outreach. So if a veteran gets into trouble, they get a caseworker and gets them hooked up with housing, substance abuse, mental health treatment, goes before the court, they provide supervision. The courts work with the caseworker and the veteran, and we have numerous success stories of that. That's more justice.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Posters up for you all to look at, check it out, okay? And we thank you so much for coming, and we hope you come back and give us a follow-up.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry for the technical.
Is there any group trying to help